Tonight's shiur is called The Snake, the Fallen Sparks, and the Forbidden Fruit. Kabbalistic approach to the first sin of Adam v'Chava, and this is part 2 in a 2-part series. Last time we discussed that the Almighty created the world in order to be able to bestow and give of His goodness, and because as the world, or as spirituality descended into this world, there had to be concealment of godliness. The more one is to receive godliness, the more one is to resemble godliness. The less one resembles godliness, the less one is able to receive. So one has to resemble, so to speak, godliness in a particular way, because physicality is an exact stark opposition to spirituality. So there has to be some sort of correspondence, some sort of resemblance, in order for there to be a connection between God, the giver, and the receiver. And man is the essence of all creation, the epoch of all creation, and he is to be the greatest recipient of God's blessing, spirituality, and bounty. And thus he must most closely resemble godliness if he is to be the recipient or to be able to receive the greatest amount of spiritual light. And we discussed last time that this was expressed in the way of being able to give. Because the essence of godliness is giving. And thus, if you are to resemble God, and if you are to be the greatest recipient of God, then you must also be similar to God, or resemble God, and be a giver rather than a receiver. And the only way to be able to achieve this is that man has the ability to be able to be a giver in this world, to be able to rectify the world, to be able to feel a partner in the world, and bring the world to its fruition and its fulfillment. And the only way to achieve that is free choice. And for the mechanism of free choice to be created, there had to be what's called a world of tohu, the world of the confounded world. And in that confounded world, there was a concept of what's called the breaking of the vessels. And from the breaking of the vessels emanated the rapah, the 288 sparks, which have to be thus elevated. And that was the source of free choice, or a feeling of independence. And why is that? Because the source of that was that in that world, or in that spiritual sphere, every godly component felt its own level of independence, and thus was not a giver. And because was not a giver, so to speak, the vessels were too extreme, and thus broke and shattered. That was done on purpose. It wasn't done, so to speak, without the divine will. It was created in that manner in order for that to be the spiritual source, or the spiritual correspondence for independence or free choice in this world. Now, this is very important. In that level, there was the 10 emanations, like in every world, there's the 10 emanations, or the 10 types of revelations. And what is unique to this world, which is not so in other worlds or in other realms, is that the 10 emanations there are 10 emanations in each world, where the highest emanation, Keter, what's called the crown or the will of God, is revealed or counted. The da'at of God, so to speak, the knowledge of God, is excluded. And where the knowledge of God is excluded, then the will of God, or the keter, the crown of God, is excluded. And thus there are 10. The unique thing in the world of Tohu is that there are in fact 11 emanations. All 11 are counted, including Keter and including Da'at. And this caused a great tension. What was the tension? The tension that was caused was, as we discussed last time, was that if the will of God is revealed and the knowledge of God is revealed in the same, so to speak, spiritual hemisphere, this causes a clash and a conflict. Why? Because as the philosophers, Maimonides and many others ask, if God knows everything, if God knows something, then it is by default going to happen, correct? And Maimonides says that this is something that's beyond human capacity to be able to understand how on the one hand God knows something to happen in the future, and yet there is still a free choice. It is a contradiction. If God knows it, that it's going to be it, then it's going to, because unlike anything else, God, as Maimonides says, Hu Amada, V'hu Hayodea, V'hu Yadua. He's the known, the knowledge, and the knower. When he knows something, God is everything. God is the essence of unity. So his knowledge is him, and him is his knowledge. It's all one. And you cannot separate it. Therefore, how can there be a possibility for there to be free choice when God knows everything? And for this reason, the divine will that there should be free choice, and that man should be created in the image of God, and correspond or have some sort of correspondence or likeness to God in order to be the ultimate recipient, this is the divine will clash with the knowledge, the divine knowledge, and thus put into effect what's called Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels, where predominantly the level of Da'at downwards, the godly divine knowledge, so to speak, shattered, and the divine will departed from that realm or that spiritual hemisphere or the world of Tohu, the confounded world, and was uplifted to a higher world, and the shattering of the vessels and the light in those worlds descended, went down, and that is, as we discussed in our original shiur about the fallen sparks, that is akin to a spiritual death. As we mentioned before, the word merahefet, the Spirit of God, merahefet hovers, contains two words. Rapah, met. 288, met, died. The 288 sparks died, meaning to say they descended similar to a body that, you take a body that was alive, it's up, it's standing upright, and when it dies, it descends, it goes down. It doesn't disintegrate, it doesn't disappear. It just simply turns into dust, but it doesn't disappear. It descends a level. And whenever, in spiritual terms, descending a level is akin to a certain level of spiritual death. Therefore, the concept of the breaking of the vessels, or the ability for there to be free choice, occurred in the divine knowledge, so to speak. And the concealment of the divine knowledge downwards into this world will facilitate free choice. So we discussed this before. This was the backdrop for the tree of knowledge of good and bad. And as I mentioned before, Kabbalah is like a map. Now we understand a little bit of the spiritual source, what took place in the spiritual source. Now we see how it corresponds in the material and physical world, how it corresponds to this world. So this is the background, this is the backdrop for the mechanism and for the justification, or for the ability for man to sin against God. God forbid. How can man sin against God? Especially Adam and Eve, that were Yetzir Kapav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They were the handiwork of God Himself. They were super intellectual and spiritual beings. How could they err? Like in the book Madrigat HaAdam, he has a whole chapter explaining the greatness from the great Alter of Novardok, the great initiator of one of the great Musar movement in the Novardok Yeshiva. Writes in his book Madrigat HaAdam the great loftiness of man. So how did man make such a great error? This error just didn't happen and occurred, and man just made a very big boo-boo and a very big mistake. This is rooted in spiritual realms and was translated down. Now let's see how it works. The first step is to understand that the concept of Da'at, of the divine knowledge, was concealed, was divine knowledge. Divine knowledge. Da'at, divine knowledge. The concept of Da'at was concealed. Now we have God created a world, and in the center of the paradise He placed a tree of knowledge of good and bad. And He commanded man not to partake of this tree of knowledge of good and bad until the world will be refined enough to be able to then partake of that. And that would have occurred on the Shabbat, because Shabbat is a very holy time, a time where things become elevated. And thus, He would have been able to elevate the divine will that was concealed, or those sparks that trickle down, or the shattered vessels, as we spoke about at length before. So what was the sin? And how were they misled to be able to God forbid, sin? So as I mentioned, the concept of the divine knowledge that's where the shattering took place, so to speak. That's where the concealment took place, and the emanations further down from it. I know it's a bit technical, but we'll grasp whatever we can. This is where they were misled. They were misled by the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Why? Came along the snake. So God tells them, don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and bad, because the day that you will eat from the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you shall surely die, meaning to say, you will bring death to the world. And spiritually speaking, death to the world means to say, you will descend. You will descend to the level, just as the higher levels, or those sparks, were shattered and descended lower down. So too, by not following the will of God, as we will soon explain, you too will descend to a lower level, and that's called death. Even death, please no questions till the end. Even death itself is not totally permanent. There will be the resurrection of the dead, the body turns into dust, so it's not absolutely permanent. It's a lowering of level, it's a descending of a level. Especially since one of the bones will actually, it never disintegrates, and there's a concept of resurrection of the dead. So, it is a descending of a level, it is not a permanent state. So comes along the snake, and he says as follows, Vayomer hanahash el ha'isha. And the nahash, the snake, tells the woman, Lomot temutun. No, you're not going to die. Meaning to say, you're not going to descend to a low spiritual level. In fact, you're going to be uplifted to a greater level, to a higher level. And we'll soon see his argument in a minute. Ki yodea Elokim, for God knows, ki biyom acholchem mimeno, the day that you will eat from it, v'nifkehu einechem, your eyes will be opened. Meaning to say that you will have increased super consciousness and super divine understanding. V'yetem ke'elokim, and you will be like God. Oh, is that not the whole purpose of creation, to be like God? What an argument, and we will soon see his argument, what he meant by being like God. V'yetem ke'elokim, you will be like God. Yodeh tov v'ra, knowing good and bad, meaning to say your free choice will be even greater enhanced. Your level of independence will be greater enhanced. Is that not the divine will? So what's the argument? First of all, let us understand that the snake is not a snake like we understand it today. It was the embodiment and the representation of impurity, of the angel of death. It had intellect, it had wisdom, basically an angel or a minister of God that was embodied in the snake. For the snake at that time was the most cunning of all animals, and he used his cunning and guile to convince Hava to succumb to sin. What was his argument? So in other words, we're talking about the evil inclination. This was the embodiment of the evil inclination. That which we currently resides within us and tempts us and argues with us and taunts us and tells us to do this or not to do this. This was an external part of Adam and Hava at that time. What was the argument? The argument is as follows. We said before that in order to be from the greatest recipient of godliness, because we are physical, there must be a resemblance. And the greatest resemblance is free choice and the exercising of free choice. The greater the free choice, the greater the level of independence, so to speak, and us exercising that free choice properly is the way God wills it, the greater we are able to receive the greatest light from God. Because there has to be a resemblance, there has to be a correspondence, as we outlined in the previous Shurim. So God, in order to express His greatest degree of kindness, gave us free choice. That free choice is not just that we shouldn't be robots. It's in order to be able to earn the greatest degree of love and God's light. So every time we exercise free choice for the good, we earn and we draw down the greatest degree of light. What type of light? A light that was so high, this beyond the capacity to be revealed in the physical world. What's called Sovev Kol Almin, the light that encompasses all worlds that cannot be revealed in this world in its current present state. But when we exercise free choice, we so refine ourselves in the world that light is able to be revealed and received. Therefore, the argument of the snake is as follows. The more you resemble God, by knowing good and bad, by asserting your independence, the more you will be then fitting to be more of a recipient of God's godliness. Now that is an ingenious argument. Because as we mentioned before, that was the whole purpose of creation. It's an ingenious argument of the snake. It was so appealing to Hava, she grabbed it, as we will soon see. Now, listen to what it says in the Pasuk. ותראה האישה כי טוב העץ למאכל וכי תאווה הוא לעיניים ונחמד העץ להשכיל ותיקח מפריו ותאכל ותיתן גם לאישה עמה ויאכל. The woman saw that the tree was good to eat and desirable to the eyes. What does desirable to the eyes mean? What does desirable to the eyes mean? So he explains that the tree was attractive as a means to gain intelligence, da'at, intelligence, divine wisdom, divine intelligence. By gaining, so to speak, more divine intelligence, more divine knowledge, you then gain more, so to speak, independence, and then you are able to then access more divine light. Is that not the will of God? Claimed the snake. And Hava felt that it was. By exposing ourselves to a greater degree of knowing good and bad, experiencing it within ourselves, because she knew that when you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and bad, it becomes a part of you. Like when you eat something, it becomes a part of you. In fact, it did. So the error was that in fact, you are not disobeying God. You are fulfilling the will of God in the greatest degree. By disobeying God, you are in fact earning the greatest level. It's absurd in a way, but it's an argument. But it is absurd. Let's see how it's absurd. And a little bit of the argument behind it. We said before that the ability to be able to have free choice is rooted in the world of Tohu. Free choice is rooted in that world that we spoke about at length, and we don't have the time to go over it. So please refer to the previous Shurim. And in that world, the concept of dat, of divine knowledge, was more concealed, or the shattering took place from there downwards. The divine will was uplifted back. There is a clash. There is a, what's the word that we used? A tension between these two concepts, the divine will and the divine knowledge. And that tension exists here in this world right now. And what is that? In the world of Tohu, what was unique about the world of Tohu, that spiritual realm or hemisphere, was the fact that began to be formulated the concept of God's external will. God's internal will, God's external will. In fact, it's already rooted in higher levels, but it found expression there. What does it mean, high will, low will? It's just a very quick example. A person goes to work. That's not his inner will. He goes to work because he needs to earn a livelihood to support his family. He wants to have a life, a family life. He wants to pay his bills. He wants to eat. He wants to pay his children's education and have some sort of quality of life. Don't go to work just for the sake of going to work. So there is a primary will and there is a secondary will, if you like, and even a third and fourth and fifth will. For example, getting on the bus, for example. You know, you get on the bus, not for the sake of getting on the bus. You get on the bus in order to be able to take you to work, of which even work itself is not a primary will, it's a secondary will, etc. So the whole world of Tohu, in a way, is expressing not God's inner will. It's the mechanism by which there is already begins to be an expression of secondary will. What does it mean, secondary will? Concealment of godliness. God doesn't want concealment, but there has to be concealment for there to be free choice. There has to be bad for there to be free choice. Does God will bad? He doesn't will bad. But there must be bad for there to be true free choice. There must be the tree of knowledge of good and bad. So quite often where we err is that we become allured or attracted to the secondary will and not the primary will. Because the secondary will also within it is a seed of God's will, is it not? It has some of God's will, but it's secondary. It's a means to a goal. It's not the goal itself. It's a means to a goal. And what is the goal? The goal is ultimately to fulfill God's will, to be obedient to God's will. And that is the primary will. Because when we obey God's will, by using and utilizing our free choice and all the world that is created around us, the good and the bad around us, we then rectify the world. We then become akin to godliness or partners to godliness, and are able then to receive the greatest revelation that this world was not able to receive prior to our fixing the world or rectifying the world. But if we take the secondary will and make that primary, then we do exactly what happened in the world of Tohu. We descend. We lower ourselves. We lower our energy to a much lower level, and that's akin to spiritual death. So for example, if God gave me free choice and He commanded me to utilize that free choice for good, as it says in the Torah, Baharta b'hayim, choose good, choose life. But the choice is yours. God wants us to choose good. The fact that God gave us the choice to choose good and bad doesn't mean that He wants, it's totally up to you and you do what you want. No, He wants us to do the right thing. And by doing the right thing, we are fulfilling His ultimate will and are recipients of the greater revelation. Don't forget, the divine will is a greater revelation than the divine knowledge. So then if I decide then, well, God gave me free choice, and they're having a sale in Pizza Hut, and I'm quite hungry, and I'm going to eat a nice pizza. So I'm now expressing my will, but I'm expressing it against the divine will. I'm asserting my independence. What am I doing? It's akin to the breaking of the vessels. I'm shattering the vessels, so to speak. I'm bringing them down. I'm descending lower. It is akin to spiritual death. So when God tells him, the day that you will eat from the tree, you will surely die, it doesn't mean to say you will just drop dead on the spot. It means to say you are then bringing the concept of a descent to the world, to yourself and to the whole world. You are bringing it down lower, as opposed to taking the breaking of the vessels or the world of Tohu and rectifying it and fixing it and uplifting it. You are doing exactly, you're emulating that by causing the shattering of the vessels. It's akin to you shattering your world or your vessels. It's akin to spiritual death, at descending to a lower level. So, for example, let's say I, for example, eat something kosher and I make a blessing on it. So I take the world and I take my will and desire, and I have a proper intention that what I eat, that I'm eating it for the sake of heaven, and that energy will then be expressed by studying or by learning or by doing something good and positive in the world. I'm thus elevating myself and the fruit that I ate. And I'm causing a rectification of the world. I'm causing an upliftment of those divine sparks that fell down and experienced, so to speak, like a spiritual death. But if I do the exact opposite, and I eat something that is not kosher, for example, then what I'm doing is causing the exact same thing. I'm replicating the concept of the breaking, the shattering of the vessels, and descending it and causing a spiritual death. A descent is akin to spiritual death. Therefore, when God tells him, the day that you will eat from it, that you will disobey me, by asserting your independence, you'll be doing the exact opposite. You'll not be uplifting the world. You will be descending. You will be bringing the world to a lower level. And that is akin to death. Not forgetting that Api Pshat, on that day, he introduced death to the world, as we discussed on our previous shurim. So the argument of the snake is that on the contrary, by disobeying God, because God wills that there should be free choice, by disobeying God and asserting your independence and eating from the tree of knowledge of good and bad and deepening your experience of free choice of good and bad and making it part and parcel of your psyche, that is how you become more corresponding to God, more in the likeness of God, and thus you will not die, meaning to say you will not descend to a lower level. That was the argument of the snake. And she saw that this is a means by which she can acquire greater level of intelligence. And she says over here, and that the tree was attractive as a means to gain intelligence. I love the next line. The next line is the best because it just shows what loyalty the woman has to her husband. And she took some of its fruit and ate it. She also gave some to her husband. I mean, that was real. She was so kind and loyal to her husband. This is akin to a famous mashal, an analogy in the Zohar in Kabbalistic writing. The whole concept of the angel or the evil inclination luring man, and man has to withstand the test and the trial, is akin to a following analogy. The analogy is as follows. The king spent an immense amount of time and effort in educating his son and making him fitting to be a prince and a future king. And so what did he do? He wanted to test him to see whether he has the gumption, the stamina, the ability to withstand trials and tribulations and pressure in this world. And and will his knowledge and grasping of refined attributes overcome his trials and tribulations? Will he have the strength to maintain a refined moral conduct and code? So he hires a harlot. He hires a woman of ill repute to seduce him and to convince him to do an act that is not in accordance with his station and status. The king's objective, of course, is to test and to see and perhaps to expose the son to where he really is at, or perhaps to give him an opportunity to muster the great strength, moral strength that you need to be able to overcome a moral test. If you're never exposed to any difficulty, you never reveal the inner reservoir of strength that you have. Now, one time, I read a very interesting story. I think it's in fact in the Guinness Book of Records, maybe that's where I read it, that the lady lifted up a car of unbelievable weight. She tried to lift up the car again, she never succeeded. People who were greater build than her tried to lift up the car, never succeeded. Why and how did she succeed lifting up the car? Her son was caught in the wheel. She frantically wanted to release her son because of that great desire and the will to release her son. She found the reservoir of strength within her to lift the car and to quickly release her son. She was never able to duplicate that. When was she able to do it? When was she able to find that strength? When she had that inner will to overcome that obstacle because of her son. So too, Hashem exposes us to different trials and tribulations in this world because we've got the ability, we've got the strength to lift up that car. We've got the moral strength. It has to be revealed. And it can only be tested through free choice. So that's what the king did. He hired a woman of ill repute and she began to seduce the child. She knows what the intention of the king is. And in fact, deep down, she doesn't want the king to heir. The prince, the son of the king, to heir. Because she knows what the real will of the king is. But nonetheless, she also has her will. And she also has her objective and her job. Her job is to fulfill as best as possible what the king asked her to do. And that is to seduce the child, the son, the prince. And she has to do it the best possible way. Now let us think for a moment. What is the inner will of the king? The external will of the king is that there should be a woman of ill repute, and that he sets into motion the mechanism by which there is a free choice and that the child, the son, is tested, and that the son overcomes, expresses his free choice in a good way by finding the strength to be moral. There can be room for error in our own psychological perception that since God created distractions of the world and this world, and maybe it's not so bad that we get caught up in all of these things. It's not so bad. Can you imagine? This would be akin, the snake's argument would be akin to the woman of ill repute who sees that the son is not going for it. He's not biting the bait. Then she uses another ruse, another guise. And she says, listen, the king hired me. He's the proof, he's the letter. He hired me to seduce you. This is the king's will. And therefore, by succumbing, you are fulfilling the will of the king. Correct or not? There is room for such an argument. But that is not the divine will. That is not the primary divine will. The divine will is not to succumb. The divine will is not to sin. The divine will is not to err. The divine will is to find the strength to overcome it. And this was the argument of the snake. The argument of the snake is God put into motion all of this mechanism. God wants you to experience and to know evil. And by doing so, you become more akin to God. You're coming closer to the will of God. So as absurd as it sounds, by disobeying God, you are obeying God in a way. Because God wants for there to be the ability to disobey Him. Yes, the ability, the potential. And that was the error. The error when we use our mind to rationalize things. The objective is obedience to God. This is the ultimate objective. This is the objective why God gave us the commandments. If for no other reason, if the commandments have no other divine reason and purpose and sublime Kabbalistic teachings and all of this stuff, for no other reason, as just an expression of obedience to God, well, that in itself is the greatest reason. You don't need any other reason for the commandments than obedience to God, or an expression to obedience to God. This is simply the tool. Mitzvot could be the tools by which we express our obedience to the divine will, not to human rationale. Not to rationalize our wrong free choices. And for this reason, man was to hold off until Shabbat. Shabbat would have elevated such a lofty day, and we're not going to discuss about the loftiness of Shabbat now. That's a separate shiur for itself. But were Adam and Hava wait for Shabbat, then there would have been enough spiritual safeguards for them to both partake of the tree of knowledge of good and bad and have a greater awareness on the one hand of bad, but a safeguard that they will not descend to a lower level. Why? Because putting aside anything else about the Shabbat and the quality of the Shabbat, it is the greatest form of resemblance or correspondence that Adam in his time, and perhaps even in our time, can resemble God. How so? 6 days a week you shall be active in mundane activities, but on the Shabbat you shall rest, for I rested on the Shabbat. What is one of the reasons given that we keep Shabbat? Because God rested, you rest on Shabbat. What's this business? God rested, so you rest on Shabbat. What? Because God rested, I have to rest on Shabbat? And if I don't want to rest? Or if for me, for example, playing sending an SMS message or playing ping pong on, on my iPod or iGame or iTunes or whatever hummus there is. That's how I rest. No good? No good. Why? What's this whole business? I rested, you got to rest on the Shabbat. I kept Shabbat, you keep Shabbat. Correspondence. Resemblance. That is the beauty of Shabbat. It is the greatest ability. God afforded Adam the greatest ability through the Shabbat to be the most similar or akin to Hashem. And by doing so, he will then be able to be the recipient of the greatest level of revelation. And when you have that uplifted and heightened level of revelation, you are then able to even uplift the 288 fallen sparks, that which were embedded in the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Resemblance. Giving to the world. The more that we resemble Hashem by giving, by rectifying the world, by expressing our free choice to be obedient to the divine will, the more we are recipient of the purpose and essence of creation, and that is that God will bestow upon us His greatest, most abundant, unlimited love and revelation. And this is why it is so important so unique and so special, the keeping of the Shabbat. That's why Shabbat affords us so many different blessings. That's why Shabbat is able to uplift the whole world back to its source. In fact, the word Shabbat spells tashuv, return. Return. Everything returns back to its source. Everything is uplifted. Even those fallen sparks are able to be uplifted and returned back. Because I rested on the Shabbat, you rested on Shabbat. Because Shabbat is really the essence of what creation is all about. And that is to receive God's greatest revelation. And we know that on Shabbat there's a greater degree of revelation than there is the rest of the days. The whole world is uplifted to a new spiritual plateau. And that spiritual strength is able to refine the whole world. Tashuv, return. Even the 288 sparks are able to return to its source. But alas, Adam did not wait for the Shabbat, chose to rationalize, to choose a different mechanism, a different way to, so to speak, be similar to God or correspond to God. By knowing good and bad, you will be like God, said the snake to Hava. And that was their downfall. And they caused them and the whole world to descend. Even the earth, everything about the world descended. Now no longer the blessing was so tangible and so seeing, because everything fell. It wasn't like a punishment more than a natural outcome or consequence. I've got a jug, I whack it with a hammer, it breaks, all the pieces fall down. No glue, nothing holding it together anymore. It descends, it falls. Its spiritual, its purpose of being a jug is no longer there now. It becomes meaningless pieces, meaningless shards, scrapes of whatever material, glass or clay or whatever. And this is why on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, what is the main thing that we do on Yom Kippur? No, not think about food. We abstain from food. We fast. Because the original sin took place with food, with eating. So we abstain. We abstain. Whenever we want to do tshuva, repentance, one of the ways to do repentance, if we can have the physical strength and stamina, is to fast. We fast as a commemoration of the original sin. Because eating is one of the most basic of human needs, and it is one of the ones that is so easily can cause us to be uplifted or to descend to the lower levels, as we see. We see sometimes people eat in a refined manner. Sometimes people eat in a very unrefined manner. I was just now in Israel, and I spent one of the days of Chol HaMoed. I was invited to a Seudah with one of the great Hasidic Rebbes in Israel today, the Rebbe of Ruzhin. And because, if you know people, the right place, what do you call it? You have the right contact, so so I got a very honorable seat right there in the front. And I noticed that the way that the Rebbe of Ruzhin was eating was a very refined way. He never ate like he was eating soup, because it's a mitzvah to eat in the sukkah, and everybody had food, by the way. Everybody had a meal, whatever. He never bent his head down to, how you eat soup. Everybody eats soup like this, especially if it's got noodles, He never bent down once to eat the soup. He took the spoon and he brought it to him. He didn't bend down to the food, but he brought the food to him. The challah was cut in small pieces. He was eating the small piece of challah in a very refined and dignified manner. And I was very impressed with just simply the manner that he ate. To me, it bespoke spiritual royalty, dignity. And I liked it very much. If nothing else, if not the words of the Torah that he said, if not the beautiful singing and the atmosphere that was prevalent, or his humility. Excuse me. Simply the way that he ate in a very dignified manner. And it's very possible that that very basic human need of eating, the need to eat, causes us to so err and so sin. Not for naught the first sin was through eating. Thank you. Because by eating, the word ma'achal, food, is the same letter, same spelling as malach, an angel. We can create spiritual energy through the food that we eat, or we can eat like an animal. Excuse me. And we can take the human being that we are, and not only the human being, but the godly soul that we have, and descend, go down, like a spiritual death, to the realm of an animal. Eat like an animal just because we desire it, we want it. Isn't obesity one of the biggest problems that we're having today? There's so much. People were skinny in those days not because they wanted to. Necessity. They just simply didn't have what we have today. People ate black bread in those days not because they wanted to. They wanted the white bread. It's because they had no choice. White bread was expensive. Today it's the exact opposite. We don't want to eat white bread. It's too cheap. Coles are selling it for $2, $1, whoever, whatever. It's the brown bread that is a symbol of wealth. Brown bread. Wealthy people eat brown bread. They don't eat this cheap white bread. Cheap. We can descend to very low rungs through food. That's why one of the basic ways of fixing things and rectifying things is through food. That's why we fast on Yom Kippur. Because we can so lowly descend. Not to speak about eating not kosher. That's already a descent of absolute spiritual death. Of which the food that we eat becomes part and parcel of who we are, to the extent that it's like Adam, that he actually descended and brought death to the world. Not to even speak about that. We're not even speaking about that level. We're speaking about simply eating kosher food, but eating it like an animal. Eating because you desire that pecan pie. And you want to eat it because you crave for it. You have a lust for it. No spiritual motivation whatsoever. No bracha, no care, no desire to perhaps use it for Shabbat. Keep it for Shabbat. I sometimes buy nice nash for my children, and I tell them, I bought a treat for Shabbat. Oh, can I have one? No. First of all, I want to teach them that Shabbat is special. Second of all, I wanted to teach them a little bit of discipline. Never mind that sometimes I cheat and taste it, just to make sure that it's worth. I do it for the sake of heaven. I want to make sure that it's worthy of Shabbat. But I want to teach them Shabbat is special. You get a treat. I'm saving it for Shabbat, not for the weekday, because we're not gluttons. We don't eat out of desire, out of temptation. So since eating is such a basic thing, it's one of the first things that we have to refine, one of the first things that we have to elevate. Which leads us, as I mentioned before, to a very interesting and powerful concept of the incense in the temple or in the tabernacle, if you remember. We gave a whole shiur about the incense, but not related to the 288 sparks. But there is a dimension of the incense that is very unique and special. First of all, how many ingredients were for the incense? 11. 11 ingredients. It's interesting that the whole concept that is repeated so many times in Torah is the number 10. 10 commandments, 10 utterances, 10 sayings, 10 emanations. They're all interlocked and interconnected. Why the incense doesn't have 10? Why does it have 11? 11? Can't have 10. Got to have 11. Why 11? Because this directly corresponds to the world of Tohu, as we mentioned before, of which there is revealed the 11 emanations, not the 10 emanations. And that is translated to the incense. And of course the incense has good and bad. Has good and bad. One of the ingredients of the incense is helbona, galbanum, which apparently smells like the durian. I don't know whether it smells like the durian, but I'm only imagining. It doesn't smell good at all. It's a very foul smelling. What's the symbolism there? Why do we have a foul smelling thing? So we discussed it in another shiur, but a different dimension of why we have the foul smelling thing is because this is the symbol of the world of Tohu, the negative aspect, the foul dimension that needs to be uplifted and elevated, the tree of knowledge of good and bad. And isn't it interesting that when there was a plague that hit the Jewish people, what did Aharon do? How did he ward off the plague of death? He took incense. Because the angel of death himself, so to speak, taught Moshe Rabbeinu the secret of the incense, that they have the ability to ward off death. What did we say death is in spiritual terms? A descending, a lowering of one's energy, spiritual energy and vitality, right? If we know the secret of what the incense are, and how that they correspond to the world of Tohu, which was the root and the spiritual source of death and of bad and of free choice, then we understand why this is responsible. If we use it for holiness, if we use it in the temple, why then this lifts and elevates those sparks to the extent that it does the exact opposite of the original sin, exact opposite of death. It ensures and protects life. Isn't it special and unique? And perhaps with this we can understand a interesting, famous, yet interesting and perplexing Gemara. The Gemara says, Yaakov lo met. Yaakov Avinu, Jacob our forefather, did not die. So the Gemara says, what do you mean they didn't die? Didn't they embalm him? Didn't they eulogize him? Didn't they mourn? Didn't they bury him? So one can explain and say, well, the righteous, they live differently. They have a different code. To them, the body is meaningless. To them, it's the spirit, it's the soul. So they never die, because they always lived their lives, the lives of the spirit, not the lives of the body. So if the physical body is now suspended, is interred, is buried, and that the soul is prevailing now, or is revealed and in its rightful place, that's what the tzaddik is all about anyway, is it not? But here we can explain a different dimension of it. What does death mean? Death means when we take our energy and we cause it to shatter or break, like in the world of Tohu, like the 288 sparks, and we descend to a lower level, like the body descending to the grave and disintegrating, not totally, but to a different form, a lower form, that of dust. Instead of the human, which is the highest, he becomes inanimate. Right? It's a descent. It's a lowering of his being. A righteous person never takes his energy. He doesn't sin. And then when you don't sin, your energy does not descend and go down to the realm of spiritual death. So Yaakov Avinu did not live his life in a spiritual descent, so to speak. He never experienced a spiritual descent. Thus, he never experienced the spiritual concept or consequence of spiritual death. Thus it makes sense that the Gemara says, Yaakov Avinu lo met, Yaakov lo met. Yaakov never died. He never experienced what the concept of tree of knowledge, the consequences of tree of knowledge were. And that is a breaking of the vessels, a descending of the spiritual energy and vitality of oneself to a lower level. But rather, his whole being was to uplift and elevate. And thus he was the essence of life. Like the 11 spices of the incense were the symbol of life. Because they rectified the world of Tohu. They rectified free choice. He rectified free choice. He was obedient to the Almighty. He realized that the concept of knowledge, of good and bad, is there only to be able to test our true obedience and willing to connect ourselves to the Almighty God. We will stop here.